everyone. So welcome to the inaugural issue of the OpenGlobal Show, which we're doing between Open Canada, a website that I edit, and Google+. So my name is Taylor Owen. I'm the research director of the Tao Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia University, and I also edit the international affairs platform that's hosting this show. The general idea of it is we want to bring together on a regular basis a group of friends, colleagues, younger thinkers in the international affairs space to analyze current events in the international area. We actually had a relatively detailed breakdown of what we were going to talk about today, but last night it became pretty clear that we should audible towards talking about Boston, both because of the events as they were unfolding, but also because of the three people we were bringing together for the first episode who have, I think, together a pretty unique lens into how things are unfolding and, even more importantly, how we're learning, I think, about how things are unfolding. So I wanted to step back a bit from some of the crazy breathlessness we've seen in the last couple of days around this and look at three moments over the last 24 hours. The first is around the manhunt that occurred both on and offline, focusing particularly on the online element and Reddit's role in tracking first the identification of the suspects and then the suspects once we had the photos from the FBI. The second moment is how the manhunt was reported and discussed online last night, which I think was a very particular string of events. And third, this morning, waking up to the revelation of the background and the identity of, or at least the backgrounds of the two suspects that were part of the manhunt. So before we dive into those, I just want to ask everyone to introduce themselves. So Catherine, do you want to go first?
Sure. So thank you so much for having me on today. My name is Catherine Marr. I'm the Director of Strategy and Engagement for the digital rights group Access Now, and I'm also a fellow with the Truman National Security Project.
Awesome. Thanks. Josh.
Hey, everyone. I'm Joshua Faust. I'm a writer and an analyst based in Washington, D.C. Write for a bunch of places, PBS, The Atlantic, increasingly now Foreign Policy. Tend to cover Central Asia and terrorism.
Not relevant at all to today's conversation. Ivan.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ivan Segal. I'm the Executive Director of Global Voices. I've also, in addition to writing and taking pictures, I've also lived in the former Soviet Union for about 8 years, including extensive stretches of time in both Central Asia and covered the first Chechen War at the end of it. So,
awesome. Thanks. So the first question I wanted to ask is whether the online tracking of these suspects was a positive or negative development in all of this, and maybe to contrast it a bit with how the traditional media has used these photos, like the way the New York Post used it, and the way other media outlets and cable news have used it. Catherine, do you want to just maybe walk us through how this played out from the event to the FBI release of the photos to the manhunt last night?
Sure. So, I mean, I think I want to start by saying that the use of sort of crowdsourced identification of individuals is not in any way a new thing. I think that we sort of first became familiar with this phenomenon out of China, where it was referred to as the human flesh search engine, to sort of counter or distinguish it from the way that, just entering in a search into Google would find results. And the idea was to bring together massive amounts of sort of individual resources and apply them in the search for clues, identities, personal information, and the like. And so this is not the first time we've seen something like this. And Reddit itself has a history of sort of coming together and actually engaging on certain issues and trying to track down individuals, as does 4chan, which is a similar sort of large online forum. Now, the way that this all came about was a British user by the name of Oops777 saw that there were these emergent sort of threads on Reddit trying to sort of address some of the issues around the bombing, provide information to individuals about resources in the aftermath, and saw that there was an emergent sort of narrative around trying to identify the suspects, and created a Find Boston Bombers subreddit, which is sort of just a thread specifically devoted to these issues, and actually laid out sort of 7 rules that were designed to facilitate the process of trying to identify these individuals, but also create some guidelines around not posting personal information, trying not to actually share these images externally with the media, which on the internet is, a pretty sort of futile rule to impose. But they started with this very large segment of images from all over the place. I think the big criticism was that most of those images were actually taken sort of 3 to 4 hours ahead of the actual time of the bombing itself. But eventually, as the Reddit sort of subreddit grew in size, more and more images were added. The success of the subreddit itself in terms of identifying these individuals is actually really very much in question. There were a number of sort of false identifications, including the sort of the accusation that idea that Sunil Tripathi, who's this student who's been missing for quite some time from Brown, was behind the bombings and sort of had a profile that seemed similar to some of the images that were circulating of the suspects. There was also the misidentification of 2 individuals, 2 young high school students whose image first sort of was highlighted on this subreddit. And to be fair, Reddit itself did not actually identify these as suspects, but that image managed to jump out of the subreddit and find itself its way to the front page of the New York Post, and sort of all the attendant implications that these 2 young men were responsible for this bombing. But I mean, at the same time, some interesting images did actually occur and were highlighted through Reddit. So there was an image taken by a marathon participant, a man by the name of David Green, who had taken a personal photo using his iPhone, and that had been posted to his own social media account, and eventually found its way onto Reddit. And from there, I think that Mr. Green was actually contacted by the FBI for having one of the highest resolution images of the suspects themselves. And so once the FBI actually released the images of the suspects, the Reddit threads around sort of this speculative approach of looking at various different possible suspects were all deleted and shut down, and now really what you have over the course of the last 24 hours is these threads that have been dedicated to trying to find out more information about these 2 individual suspects, including their background information, personal bios, digging up their social media accounts, and the like.
Right. So Matthew Ingram had a good post about this yesterday, talking about the difference between, like, is this just an extension of online journalism, or is this online vigilantism?
Right.
How do we represent this, what's happening?
I mean, it's an interesting question. There was sort of a narrative around whether or not this is considered the media, and the FBI actually released a statement shortly after some individuals had been falsely identified as potential suspects, asking that the media sort of hold its fire. And some online commentators responded to that, saying that the FBI was specifically sort of sending a message to Reddit itself. And there is a question: is Reddit the media? I mean, Reddit is a community; it's a community of individuals. Certainly, it is a place to which the media turns for information. It's a place to which the media turns to sort of assess the zeitgeist. Reddit has been very powerful in driving media narratives in the past. It certainly has had and played that role, and has relished playing that role at times. And yet, at the same time, you have sort of these 7 rules that I suggested, or that I mentioned earlier, that lay out things like, we are a community, we're not the media, leave this to the professionals. And so there is sort of a tension there with regards to sort of Reddit's own self-perception as to what it actually constitutes and the role that it plays in this particular sort of ongoing public discourse.
Ivan, so you run a community of citizens who act and a community of citizens who act in many ways as a media. How do you view the Reddit community? What are the overlaps with Global Voices, and the role it plays in the media discourse?
Well, Global Voices has a much more focused or intentional approach to content that's online, and the way that we work is we're aiming to search all sorts of different social media and citizen media blogging platforms, and finding stories that have resonance for global audiences. So we do this kind of thing all the time. But the Reddit community is very, very focused on conversation, on participating at the level of a kind of an ongoing chats and ongoing discussion. And Global Voices content is much more about building stories that then can be translated and shared for broader and global voices and global perspectives. So we use Reddit often as a source of content, and we are also our stories also go out in that space. But it's a very different kind of construct in the citizen media environment.
Yeah.
And the main difference, I think, is that for many social media sites, the goal is expansiveness. So something like Twitter, if you look at an ongoing Twitter feed, for instance, of #Watertown right now, it's just a flood of content. And our aim is to focus narrowly as possible on the right information or the useful information to encapsulate an idea or a story.
Oh yeah. Josh, when you look at how this played out in the Reddit community versus in the traditional media, how those photos were used, and the glaring example is the New York Post scenario, which I don't think anybody would want to characterize all of traditional media by the actions of the New York Post in this case. So are we overly generalizing the way the online community has used these images?
I actually think there's been a tendency to overplay people's hand in speculation in all of this. The New York Post, I think, rightfully does get criticized for overstepping the bounds of what they really knew in reporting. But other news agencies have as well. Yesterday, CNN, Fox News, and the AP were falsely reporting that people had been arrested in relation to these bombings. That turned out not to be true. They thought they had trusted sources. They went live with it. They were talking about it on TV at length, and hours later they were kind of forced to walk back and retract a lot of the reporting that they were engaging in. So it's not just, I think, a unique aspect to Reddit or even just to online crowdsourcing in general that can lead people to leaping the gun, and it's not just limited to more tabloidy, if I can say that, news outlets like the New York Post. Ostensibly respectable, mainstream, very serious news organizations fall for this as well. I would actually pin it less as a consequence of trying to crowdsource and more as a consequence of everyone in this vicious race to be first out the gate with a specific piece of information. It leads to confirmation bias. It leads to people connecting the dots in a way that they probably wouldn't if they were thinking about it much more calmly. And it leads to relying on privileged insider access in the absence of being able to either cross-check it, verify it, or contextualize it in light of other knowledge that we know. And this is played out, I think, in everywhere that we see media trying to understand what happened.
And we saw that privileged access lead to some pretty big mistakes particularly in cable news, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, again, CNN and the AP, the Associated Press, they spent hours yesterday pushing this false line that the FBI had arrested people yesterday in relation to these attacks, and it just wasn't true.
Right. All right. The second moment that I wanted to touch on here was last night when this manhunt was occurring. So I landed in Austin last night. Ironically, I'm here for a Future of Online Journalism conference, so they're going to have nothing to talk about for the next 2 days. But I landed and opened Twitter, and here's this amazing stream of people doing two things, really. One, live tweeting the police scanner, the Boston police scanner. And so we were getting this real-time feed in Twitter about the movement of police and the status of the manhunt. And then people were on the ground reporting using Twitter, right? So you had these two different information feeds happening at once. And counter to that, you had two elements of the traditional media counterbalancing each other. You had the local news, which in many ways these network affiliates, I think, probably have proved their utility and were showing how valuable they can be in these kinds of events. And you had the national cable news, which just seemed utterly tone deaf. When I got to my hotel, I turned on CNN, and it was incredible. I mean, Jake Tapper had just been woken up to get behind a camera and was trying to simultaneously follow Twitter and broadcast on air, and it was just an awkward mesh of information. Ivan, how do you see that ecosystem emerging in the breaking news space? Do we just have new formats we have to embrace, or is this a real shift occurring in how we understand breaking news?
Well, it's less of a real shift and more of a gradual progression. There are moments in the history of online reporting that seem like they're thresholds to a mass audience in the United States. So, for instance, the 2009 Iranian protests around the election seemed like a threshold moment because it entered a mass media space. But this is already a decade-long story in terms of a progressive use of different social media or citizen media tools that are playing role in stories, whether they're external individuals who happen to be catching a news story on the spot, or whether it's in a case like this in which everybody on the ground has the capacity. I mean, look last year at the case of the cop in Oakland who shot a man on a train platform, and the way that was documented by roughly eight people on using their cell phones. So it's an ongoing trend. I appreciate your idea that this is somehow crossed some kind of threshold, and that this is in which the news, the mainstream media, cable news especially, are racing to try to beat the internet. And of course, we've all learned that nobody's really going to beat the internet for more than a couple minutes, or 30 seconds at most. Right. And I think that tension that the cable news folks are dealing with is, as Joshua pointed out, trying to recognizing that for their relevance, they have to win. They have to try to be there first. Maybe that's causing them to make mistakes, but and maybe not. But what's really interesting to me is that they seem to have a sense of impunity around their error, almost as if the news function or the news value of what they're producing is less important than the fact that they're talking. So it's more important that it's Jake Tapper on the air than it is what he's saying. And that points to something that's very clear about the nature of cable television news, which is that it's entertainment. It's one part sensation and one part engagement with a character that you know and maybe rely on and maybe trust. And in a given context, what he or she might be saying is maybe a little bit less important. And the constant presence of other voices in the often chaotic, often sometimes wrong, but always interesting citizen or social media space serves to contextualize that very controlled and very structured cable space. Right. And I mean, the way I got this story this morning when I woke up here in California is I opened my Twitter app, and I searched hash Watertown, and I just tried to scan a stream of words that were coming through, and I picked out words, one or two words in each post as it came through, in the 2 seconds that I had for each one, and I kind of absorbed the story that way through a series of keywords that my eyes latched onto. And it pretty much accorded to the story that was on cable television. So there's all sorts of ways to kind of absorb this material, and that was the way I tried today.
Josh, you engage a lot with cable news, and you exist immersed in social media as well. How do you see the interaction on a story like this playing out?
I mean, it's been interesting in this case, and yesterday I think was a particularly interesting example of this. You had kind of the mainstream old standby media groups, either newspapers or public radio or cable TV or local news, lamenting how social media has whipped everyone up into a frenzy, and like Twitter was getting the story wrong, and this was causing all of these unforced errors in reporting and altering public perception. When in reality, I mean, especially yesterday, it was Twitter and other kinds of social media who were pointing out either inconsistencies or unbelievable aspects of what mainstream organizations were reporting. So, I mean, in a way, this is to kind of follow up on what Ivan was saying, is that, social media in a lot of ways has a self-correcting mechanism built into it, where if someone is either way out in left field or babbling nonsense or doing something similar, they're going to get called on it. And my experience, at least, is that they get called on it really quickly. And I mean, I've had my share of humbling experiences on this front as well. Being demonstrated to be wrong about something when you're in a conversation with a bunch of people is really hard to back down from. The mainstream media, on the other hand, their biggest appeal is their reputation. I mean, I agree that there's an entertainment aspect to it. There's also a personality aspect to it. I mean, when you think about it, the people that they have on TV talking as experts usually are nothing of the sort. And I've had a really hard time finding relevant information in these kind of foils that anchors bring on air to talk, where in contrast, you can just go to the direct Twitter feed of, say, an academic who's studying the issue that's in the news right now and is actively providing context and actively providing instant analysis to what's happening. And the difference in the quality of information you get from both sources is really remarkable. So while we were learning this news about either what was happening with the suspects or who was being arrested, or even this morning learning that these two men who were, well, I guess one is being pursued and the other one who got killed, how they have a connection to Chechnya, what that means. There are people who have experience in the former Soviet Union, like Ivan, who lived in Chechnya, who have this detailed personal understanding because they spent years studying it, that you can directly access and directly see what they're saying and how they're contextualizing it. And it's almost the opposite of what you see either on TV or being pumped out as kind of the instant expertise machine that the more traditional media goes to. And I mean, just beyond saying that, the contrast is really remarkable. You know, the quality of information, I think, is really remarkable as well.
Yeah, I agree. I thought that the feedback loop of corrections is something that is so radically different in a Twitter ecosystem than online. And that John King apology was incredible, I thought, hours after saying, I was wrong, but I'm not racist, right? That was the dichotomy that was presented as an apology, as opposed to a nuanced conversation about why it was wrong and how quickly we can understand that it's wrong and all that. Catherine, I was struck by Evan's connection back to the Arab Spring on this. As someone who was pretty engaged in that ecosystem, is this just an extension of things that we started seeing in Iran, and now it's on steroids because it's in the United States and in the American media world?
Well, I mean, I would definitely caution by saying that the Iranian Revolution is not the Arab Spring, and just as a sort of point of clarification. But I do think that, I think that one of the interesting things that we saw with regards to these sort of as events unfolded in the Middle East was a lot of backlash against people who were tweeting on the ground, who are often operating in environments where their information was incomplete. It was entirely sort of localized. It lacked sort of sufficient international or even regional context, and was quite often, frankly, wrong and based on rumor and hearsay. And it was interesting to watch a lot of the sort of media watchers here in the U.S. and people on Twitter criticizing this and saying that these were highly unreliable narrators and you couldn't really take them seriously. And all of the sort of promise of the Arab Spring on Twitter and sort of the promise of Twitter as a means of conveying some newsworthy information was not living up to its potential. And now here we are 2 years later, and I think we're replicating the exact same sort of environment in the story of this sort of in the context of this national news story. So I mean, I do think that it certainly gives me quite a bit of sympathy for those individuals who were sort of slandered for their lack of accuracy at that time. But I do think that, one of the wonderful things about the use of Twitter in this context and sort of the contrast with regards to the national news or national cable stories is that you do actually have the ability of accessing people who have information about what is sort of contextual and local and placing the sort of unfolding events within that situational environment. That's certainly something that we saw with regards to events in the Middle East, whether it be in Egypt or Libya or Tunisia or the like, was the ability to find individuals who had highly specialized information at a period in time, and then to move away from them when that information was no longer relevant. And I think that that's one of the big differences that you see with the cable news sort of machine, is that you have an individual who is expected to have sort of omnibus information and be able to be an expert on all things, whereas sort of the fluidity of social media allows us to pick and choose our experts based on the context or the narrative. And that's significantly different. And those individuals who are acting as reporters or sort of manning the desks at these major cable stations, they don't have the ability to sort of correct themselves on the fly, which is, I think, sort of the advantageous aspect. I could be sitting here Googling right now and you wouldn't necessarily even know it.
And you probably are.
I'm not, no. I did my Googling before we came on. But I think that is significantly different. One thing I will say, though, is that I think that there is, with regards to the cable news stories and sort of the credibility that Joshua mentioned and sort of the importance that has as sort of as a cultural weight, I did notice that in an interview with the people who created sort of the subreddit, one of the things that they said is that the worst case scenario is that we waste our time. And I think that speaks quite a lot to sort of the digital dualism that exists with regards to social media and its role in sort of augmenting the traditional media, which is to say that people tend to take on these sort of roles as communicators and conveyors of information in the social media space and not sort of afford it sort of the seriousness that it deserves. And even though it is true that we are all sort of amateurs in this space in some way when we're on Twitter and when we're on Facebook and the like, the reality is that the worst case scenario is not that we're just wasting our time. The worst case scenario is exactly what we saw with the New York Post, which is that information jumps out of the social media enclave onto another platform. It takes this sort of trans-platform jump and it results in sort of real-world consequences for individuals.
I agree. So, mindful of time, the third moment I wanted to talk about was one that Josh particularly was intimately involved in this morning, when news started circulating about the background of two suspects. Josh, I woke up and one of the first things I saw on Twitter was your face, which was lovely. Thank you for that. But these two tweets, which I want to read because I think are kind of indicative of what you're arguing this morning. So first, quoting your Twitter feed. So these guys are ethnic Chechens, but either from Turkey or Kyrgyzstan, lived outside of Chechnya for almost all of their lives. Come on, people. And second, and no, reading Wikipedia does not give you enough background to talk about Chechnya right now. So do you want to maybe just talk us through what you experienced waking up and how you engaged and who you engaged with in this conversation and what kind of the warnings you were injecting into the debate?
Yeah. So when I woke up this morning, I mean, I'm a little embarrassed to admit that one of the first things I do waking up in the morning is I pull out my phone and check Twitter. It's just kind of a reality check about whatever's going on at the moment. And I saw a couple of people who woke up before me who were tagging me in conversations because of this revelation that these two alleged bombers were Chechen. The reason they were tagging me in it is because in an entirely different context, which is the war in Afghanistan, for several years, there have been allegations of there being either Chechen fighters or elite Chechen militant groups or some unique Chechen aspect to militancy in that country. And I spent a lot of time debunking it. When I worked for the Defense Department, the U.S. Defense Department, I wrote critical assessments about how there really weren't Chechens in this country. So, I mean, like, for several years, I've been publicly kind of fighting this assumption that Chechens are either inherently militaristic or prone to militancy or uniquely international in how they prosecute militancy. And so because of that, people who were aware of my work on that were kind of jokingly saying, ha, 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 Josh, hey, look, here are Chechens in Boston, what do you think? Then digging into it and seeing kind of the immediate reaction from that, people were building off of this, saying things. I read right before we had our, right before we started the segment today on foreign policy, on Tom Ricks's blog at Foreign Policy, someone was posting that this means now Chechnya's war has come to the United States. And there was a lot of this kind of talk, which I think is just utter nonsense. The little bit that we know about these two guys is that they fled Chechnya very early on, probably in the early 90s, maybe the mid-90s, maybe the late 90s, but very early in their lives, their family fled the fighting. They lived in a variety of places. I've heard conflicting reports about either Turkey, Kyrgyzstan, maybe Kazakhstan. Everyone has slightly different versions of it, but the key point here is that they left Chechnya early on, and a decade ago settled in the United States. Just today, actually at another place on foreign policy, Josh Rogan was reporting that at least one of them was a naturalized U.S. citizen. So to then take this, to take people who have essentially declared themselves to be Americans, they've settled here, they went to school here, they've lived here for a really long time, and to say that there was something kind of Chechen about what they were doing struck me as really irresponsible. Because we have no idea why they did this. We haven't talked to them. We haven't gotten inside their motivations. We don't know who they were talking to. We don't know why they decided to plant these bombs in the first place. So all of this was just empty speculation. That's what that "come on, people" was about. The kind of upbraiding about Wikipedia was the fact that just about every media commentator, pundit, terrorism expert, self-described security or conflict expert was pounding places like Wikipedia to try to pull out what I call World Factbook facts. CIA World Factbook facts about Chechnya, like, oh, it has this number of population. Oh, did you know this many people died in the first Chechen war? And all of these facts are neat, but they don't really tell you anything about these two guys. Right. They don't tell you anything about their background, about their affiliations, about if someone who emigrates here at the age of 9 can really be considered to be Chechen in a very socialized, like, Chechen sense of the word. So, you know, these are the kinds of questions that I think are much more relevant when we're evaluating why these two men decided to commit an act of violence that just wasn't making its way into the conversation. So, I mean, I did what I usually do on Twitter and just began yelling at people for being stupid. And it kind of blossomed from there.
Right. Ivan, do you want to jump in here? I mean...
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, one of the first things I did was once I digested all the information, is I went on to contact the Russian social website, and I've actually been reading Johar Tsarnaev's homepage, of which, by the way, it's fascinating because there are now nearly 2,900 comments on the page. Most people yelling at him, basically saying, "You asshole, you should be dead." So people all over the world have gotten on his page and are attacking him personally, which is a fascinating thing. If you jump on, I mean, I'll show the homepage for his page with you guys. And some of it's in English and some of it's in Russian.
What platform is this on? Can you explain?
This is VKontakte, which is a Russian social network. It means in contact, and it's one of 3 very popular Russian social network platforms. So on his page, there's not that much information about what he likes and who he is. He's got this picture of him looking like a young Bob Dylan, and he's he has a description of his past. So he was in Mashkala in Dagestan in 1999 and 2001 for his first school, and then he was studied in Cambridge in Latin. His worldview is Islam, his personal priorities, career, and money. He has a little joke here, which maybe shows us something about him, which I'll translate to you into Russian, which is, in Russia they give us a test. In school they give us a test. A car is driving. In that car sits a Dagestani, a Chechen, and an English. The question: who's driving the machine? The answer: the police. So this is the kind of context in which we know that he does actually have a set of relationships with people in Chechnya from that kind of humor, or in the former Soviet world. So he's still embedded in that culture, because that's a very typical kind of conversation. It doesn't tell us anything at all about his relationship to possible militancy groups or any other kind of question about besides a slightly aggrieved and somewhat humorous and wry worldview. We don't know anything about him. But if you have the time, taking a look at the attacks on him is fascinating. And I think that one of the last things I want to say about this is that the degree to which these social media platforms have narrowed the space from between an individual in the world and a global event. The fact that any one of those people on Twitter from Watertown or anyone else can actually just jump on another part of the web and converse directly with the family of the person they just did this to, unmediated by cable television, unmediated by anything, is a fascinating kind of phenomenon, and everybody is taking advantage of that right now. So it's worth observing that stream.
Is there anything at all that we should know about his background that's relevant to today's conversation, or is this just
wouldn't speculate.
Totally irrelevant?
I mean, this versus Newtown. So what's the difference? I mean, it's foolish for us to speculate about that right now, right? I mean, two young men living a couple hundred miles from each other, committing atrocious acts of violence. One of them was American. One was also American and of Chechen descent. What does that mean?
Yeah. Yeah. Catherine, on this idea of their background being relevant, the other thing that played out is Deadspin and BuzzFeed both did these kind of instant profiles of everything we could learn online about both suspects. Is that of any use, or is that just noise as well?
I mean, I think it's noise. Exactly as I think Joshua and Ivan have said, we don't have any context as to why these individuals committed these acts. And in some ways, that the actions of Deadspin and BuzzFeed are not dissimilar than the actions of a group like Anonymous, which, when Anonymous does that, it's called doxing, which is they go out and they find all the information they can possibly find about you on the internet, and they dump it in Pastebin, and then it's out there for the world to see. And when this usually happens, the media goes, "Oh, this is so terrible. What a violation of privacy. Isn't this unfair to the individual?" As far as I'm aware, these individuals are still suspects. They haven't been proven guilty of any crime. And yet we're here dumping all of this information about them on the media. And so, with regards to that, I don't see necessarily any sort of moral distinction between sort of the actions of a hacktivist collective and the actions of organizations that call themselves the media. I don't see that it's helpful. I think it's a violation of privacy, certainly if you're going to take sort of a very literalist understanding of it. And it doesn't provide us any more information about the intent of these crimes, nor does it provide us with any resolution for the victims of these crimes. It doesn't advance us in any direction towards sort of a lawful resolution of a trial of these individuals who are, yes, of course, are suspects, but I think that what we see is a presumption of guilt in the absence of actually any process.
And that absence of process in a world where more and more of that information is stored either by us or people that governments have access to, does that point to to a trend of where this is going?
Well, I mean, I think that this points to the fact that we all are very unaware of sort of the implications of having a tremendous amount of information about us available on the internet, and sort of the privacy through obscurity, which I think most people tend to sort of the approach. Privacy through obscurity approach through which most people tend to live their digital lives. You know, what this means in sort of the context of a large scale of a crime or an atrocity or of this nature, it means that that information is then available for the media to pour through and draw conclusions around. Whether those conclusions are based in fact or intent, it remains very much up in the air. But I do think that, you know, as far as sort of the broader trend of what it means for sort of society, is just that this information is all out there in public, whether we're recognizing it or not. We do leave our digital footprints, and you know, there then exists the opportunity for individuals to draw possibly entirely mistaken conclusions about us and on sort of the background and sets of circumstances which inform the decisions that we take, the actions and the things that we say. I think that it's something of a lesson. I'm not suggesting that this individual is not guilty. I'm just saying that as of now, we should continue to regard them as suspects in this crime, and the sort of dumping of this information is not, to my way of thinking, helpful from a journalistic perspective or in terms of actually providing resolution.
There we go. Well said. Okay, so the last thing I want to do really quickly before we all head off is I think it's pretty safe to assume that this story is going to absolutely dominate everything in the media for the next week. And I just want to get a quick sense from each of you of what you think this is going to drown out. What's an example of one story we should be talking about in the next week that we won't be? Ivan?
The largest earthquake in the last 50 years in the Pakistani-Iranian border.
Josh?
The Ricin letters sent to the U.S. Senate.
Catherine?
Yeah, I was trying to come up with a good answer for that, to be honest, and I'm not sure that I have one. I think that one of the really interesting things that I've seen is a fallout on some of the sort of national security commentator lists that I see, and what this means with regards to sort of the renegotiation. Senator McCain has put forward a statement about the renegotiation of the authorization of use of military force and what that means in sort of a post-9/11 world 10 years on. I think that this will be an interesting conversation. I'm not sure this will drown it out, but I am curious to see the way that this entire incident fans the flames of sort of national security in response to terrorism.
All right, guys. Thanks so much. That was a ton of fun, and I hope I can convince you to come back and do it again.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Take care. Talk to you guys soon.